to the EmpowHERment, tackling unconscious gender bias in the workplace. I'm the Lord Mayor of Dublin Hazel Chu. I'm delighted to welcome you here today. This webinar is going to be focused on gender bias or unconscious bias, actually, because we've all had some experience of it in different ways, in the workplace, in society, in various forms. So today we're going to be talking about how to tackle them, especially in the workplace, because what we've noticed in the workplace is that there is distinct unconscious bias when it comes to how people progress. I'm delighted to be here with some guests today. So this is just a stats slide in relation to the research that has been done. So Grant Thornton International 2021 Women in Business Report showed that 33% of women in Ireland hold leadership roles, while just 26% of women globally are in CEO positions. But some progress is being made, but it's quite slow. So representation of women on the boards of Ireland's 20 biggest publicly quoted companies has now reached 30%, up from 18% less than 3 years ago. The increase occurred after the government launched the Better Balance for Business Group to monitor the gender mix at the top Irish businesses. So we're going to have another slide, I think, come in So what measures can be introduced to tackle unconscious gender bias so that women can excel in their careers and we have more gender balance in the workplace? This is what this workshop or this webinar we're hoping to do. We're hoping to talk to some great guests, and our guests include today Sinead McSweeney, Vice President of Public Policy at Twitter. So hi Sinead in EMEA. We have Laura Casey. I don't even think Laura needs an introduction at this stage. She's a broadcaster, entrepreneur and human rights campaigner, and she has been such a huge advocate of women for as long as I know. Orla O'Connor, chair of Arthur Cox and partner in firm's finance group, and I've heard many great things about Orla even before I get to meet her today. So, and finally, Lorna Conn from a group chief of executive financial officer at CPL, and Orla and Lorna again is one of those powerhouses in industries that we hear a lot about. So it's great to have all four of you here from different sectors in the industry and to talk about your experience. A little later, we're going to be talking to Ireland's former president, Mary McAleese, who will share her experiences on the bigger barriers. But the interesting thing with Mary is that she has been doing projects on unconscious bias for a while. She actually led on some papers and research on the subject, so she has a plethora of experience. We'll also explore the proactive measures that business and government can implement to overcome these barriers. What we're hoping to do from these sessions, folks, is to create a paper that we will be forwarding on then to the Ministers of Integration and Children and Equality, Roderick O'Gorman, and also the Minister of Justice, Helen McEntee, because we do think that there is the discussion here that needs to be had, but there has to be a very proactive action of what happens afterwards, of what can be done in terms of policy and political change. So just some housekeeping. If you'd like to ask any questions or share your experiences through this webinar, then please do so. Simply click the Ask a Question button on the right hand of the screen and type your question or comment in there, and that will be relayed onto myself and directed onto the panel. So without further ado, I'd like to begin by doing a quick audience poll. You'll see the audience poll is on the same panel on the right next to the Ask Questions tab. I think there's a slide coming up for it, for the questions. So the question is very simple. Have you ever experienced unconscious gender bias? So if you can click on the tab, that would be great. And we'll wait a few minutes while the poll happens. We're still here, by the way. We're just waiting. Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you. So first, there may be some of you here today thinking, what exactly is unconscious gender bias? What causes it, and can it be overcome? So it's hard for me to explain, so I'm going to have someone else to explain, but I can definitely assure everyone that I definitely have felt it in across all industries, especially in the political sphere, but in every corner of what we do in life. So I think earlier this week, though, we spoke to Ella Jenkins, psychologist and consultant with Ogilvy Consulting Behavioral Science Practice, to share some insights into what exactly it is. So that will hopefully provide everyone some insight that we're going to then go to our panel to talk about. So here we go with...
Unconscious bias refers to attitudes and beliefs we have about social groups that are outside of our conscious awareness. This can include our unintended people preferences for things like gender, race, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, and even weight. Now, everyone has unconscious bias, but it can be different for different people. As humans, we're hardwired to make fast and intuitive decisions about the world around us. At any one time, we're actually gathering information, 11 million bits of data points from all of our 5 senses. So of course our brain can't consciously respond or even attend to all of this information. And it has to make snap judgments about what's the most important. And to do this, it uses something called mental shortcuts. And most of the time, we do a really good job of this. But the problem is, whilst our lifestyles have changed and we've adapted to the environment we now find ourselves in, our brain hasn't actually evolved as quickly. So the mental shortcuts that we use to quickly respond can actually become a bit outdated and sometimes can trip us up. Unconscious bias can become a problem when the messages from society start to influence these mental shortcuts, which means we can disproportionately affect certain groups in certain ways. For example, studies have shown that physically attractive people are perceived to be more sociable, dominant, warm, intelligent, and mentally healthy than unattractive people. But I think we can all probably agree that being intelligent, mentally healthy, and dominant, in fact, has nothing to do with physical attractiveness. So where is this link and what's happening here? We refer to it in behavioural science as something called the halo effect. And it's where attributes can cast a halo over unrelated things. So in this example, physical attractiveness is causing a halo over things that it's completely unrelated to. And the same thing can actually happen with height. And research has shown that in America, an extra 2 inches of height can be equivalent to an extra $800 a year in salary, which is almost a whole extra year of experience. But on the flip side of this is something called the horns effect, where unrelated attributes can actually cause a negative shadow over people's perceptions and judgments. So disliking one aspect of someone or holding a certain view about them potentially can generate negative feelings about the person as a whole. The million-dollar question, can we actually overcome our biases? Yes and no. It's actually impossible to overcome our unconscious bias. This is because they're hardwired into us, into our DNA, and we can't get rid of them. But critically, we need them to be able to respond to the world around us, to keep us safe and to keep us functioning day to day. What we can do is we can teach people to recognise their biases. And our behavioural science practice actually runs unconscious bias training, where we invite people to take a test, something called the implicit association test, which was developed by Harvard University. And it uses the speed of our reactions to map the closeness of our associations between social groups and positive or negative attributes. And doing tests like this can allow us to really highlight what our unconscious biases are and then accept them. However, training isn't actually enough. A recent review found that US corporations spend $8 billion a year on diversity training, but this isn't enough and it's not having big enough effects. What we need to do on top of this is modify the work environment and put things in place so that our unconscious bias doesn't influence our actual behaviour. For example, when we're thinking about recruitment and selection, some of the most important things we can do is right from the start. So when we're creating job descriptions, we need to check the language. We need to check that the language we're not using is gendered or focused in some way to attract either males or females. An example of this would be a job description containing the words strong, leader, competitive, as opposed to a job description containing the words team player, warm, happy, lively. And these two different descriptions might overly attract males on one side and females on the other. Now, there's actually software we can use to run our job descriptions through and check how the language is working. After that, when we're assessing candidates, we need to blind CVs. So we need to remove any extraneous information that could negatively affect our judgment of someone before we've actually seen if they're credible. And then finally, when we're hiring, we need to hire in groups. So can we try and hire more than one candidate at once? Because research has suggested that when we hire more than one person, we're more likely to choose a representative sample.
Unmute myself, the joys of Zoom. Folks, thank you so much to Ella there. And I think we all have, definitely when I listen to her talk, I kind of have different parts of me going, oh yes, that sounds familiar. And it seems like it sounds familiar to all of you because 82% of you have said, yes, you have experienced it. And 16% said you didn't know. And so far we have 2% that have said no. So it is a massive, I guess, result in terms of confirming that everyone has experienced unconscious bias in some form, be it in the workplace or outside of it. So I actually want to hear now from some of our panels, because with the wealth of experience that these folks have, it'd be great to see and hear what they feel in terms of unconscious bias. So Sinead, I'm going to come to you first as the VP of Public Policy on Twitter. How has your career been when it comes to unconscious bias? Have you witnessed it? Have you ever experienced it? And give us a bit of insight about that.
Thanks, Lord Mayor. I think it's fascinating, actually, listening to the kind of science behind all of this, and yet at the same time recognizing the reality of it from daily life. So, I mean, my career started in politics and then in policing, both of which I guess are traditionally male-dominated professions. And now I'm in tech, where there's a concerted effort to, again, shift from something that's very male-dominated. I mean, the simple answer is yes, I have both experienced and witnessed unconscious gender bias. And I think to kind of almost illustrate what it is, it's people making assumptions about what your role in the room is, or what your role in a meeting is, because of your gender, or as I often describe it, the teapot standoff when tea and coffee are served at the start of a meeting, and this kind of waiting to see which of the women will volunteer to serve the tea, coffee, and biscuits to everybody.
Or the handing you the notebook one with a pen attached for note taking. Yeah.
Well, interestingly, I had an experience when I was in Northern Ireland where I was sitting beside our Chief Constable as his head of media and public relations at a critical meeting about a high-profile police operation, and actually a senior female politician leaned over at the end of the meeting, patted my hand and thanked me for taking the notes. So, you know, we have all experienced it. And I think, you know what, men experience it too. Maybe not so much in the workplace, but they experience it in the context of their home lives. You know, there is a presumption that it is the female in the house who will, be the one out buying school uniforms or organising the birthday parties. And I think sometimes fathers feel excluded from those social aspects of their children's lives. So, as I say, while women may experience a lot of unconscious gender bias, we're maybe also need to be aware of our own biases towards others.
Yeah, and this is the whole point about unconscious bias. Sometimes we just don't notice it. Laura, I'm going to move on to yourself and ask, in your career and in what you have experienced, what are the times and what are the kind of things that you've witnessed that kind of showed, oh, this is something that is very much there? Oh.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I'd say that my whole life feels like it's battling against unconscious, or sometimes I think subconscious bias, and sometimes, sadly, it's conscious bias. But I grew up in the Phoenix Park and I went to a deaf school. And I think from the get-go, somebody like me, it's very unlikely that I would end up doing what I'm doing. So it was fine when I was in the UK, but when I came back to Dublin and people started asking me all sorts of questions about my schooling and where I went and where I came from, they were automatically judging me and my abilities and my characteristics. The first profession I went into was nursing. And by default, nursing is full of unconscious bias. I mean, we see it now that somehow these angels of mercy, deserve hand claps rather than the millions that we've given to COVID going in some direction towards them. And people would make comments to me like, did you not get the qualifications to do medicine? Or, why is it that you chose nursing? The idea that you were a handmaiden and that you could be paid in job satisfaction rather than being paid in real money. Then flash forward to my life in boardrooms, and I worked for Smurfits, the Smurfit Kappa Group, an amazing group, but I was the only woman of 46 CEOs in Europe. And at that time, memos would always arrive to Dear Gentleman and Norah. So it was incredibly difficult, I think, to stand out and I guess to make your voice heard within that kind of environment. I reported to France for a long period of my time. I'd remind you just at this moment that it's only in 2017 that our Minister for State, John Halligan, asked a very senior civil servant at interview, was she married and did she have children? And was very surprised afterwards to find that that wasn't appropriate. So my French boss, who, by the way, said my name very sexily, Norah, and I was his star pupil by far because I was always doing my homework and my returns were huge. I had turned a very difficult company around by an enormous margin. But I had a baby and I had 3 years of IVF, to put the context in, and just before I effectively got pregnant, I had lost twins at a miscarriage, and I had given up on IVF, and then lo and behold, 2 or 3 months later, I was pregnant with Dara, my boy. I still have a photo of him at 6 weeks old. So a very, very difficult, tumultuous experience, and I knew I'd never have another child. But my boss wanted me to take on some more CEO roles of other companies, and he would fly into London, and regularly, I would say every 2 months, he would sit there and talk to me about me, where I was going, what my career would be, and inevitably, he always said, so Norah, what about more babies? And I would go through that painful process of explaining to him time and again that I had had 3 years of IVF and the whole story behind it and how I would never have any other babies. And he'd say, okay, let's talk about your promotion, let the companies that, and then he would stall and he would have another conversation with me about it. Now, the reality is from being pregnant with Dara, run of companies, but I often wonder if I'd answered that question differently, whether I would have achieved what I achieved. I would only say one more thing, that I ended up sitting on a lot of board room tables in London and here in Dublin. And I know why I sat there, because I dragged myself to the University of Wales, did my MPhil, went on to my PhD, studied strategic management at Ashridge. I can't tell you all the things I did in order to get to where I am. And when I looked around the table, I wasn't entirely sure why some of the other people were around that table. They shared similar surnames to very famous people. They went to school maybe with the chairman. They played rugby or they played golf. So when people talk about women and quotas and tokenism, I'd like to just say tokenism is alive and well in the boardrooms all over Dublin, all over Ireland, and it's not women that are sitting in those seats.
I couldn't agree more. So like honestly, just hearing that and hearing the personal experience is so, it's incredible. But also hearing the tokenism line, and it's so true. So I'm going to move on to Lorna and Orla. Lorna, from your area, I guess we're looking at finance. We're looking at very male-dominated area. What has your experience been in the area?
Thank you, Lord Mayor. So I would echo a lot of what Norah actually said. My experience in terms of being exposed to gender bias really kind of kicked into full gear when I had children. So I have 3 young children, aged 9 and under. And I remember returning from my first maternity leave. And a vacancy had arisen in the largest subsidiary of the business that I worked for at the time, and it was in the US. And I remember sitting in my office thinking, oh my gosh, imagine if I'm offered this opportunity. And I can still recall kind of the flush of blue cheeks thinking, oh, then, they'll never ask me. But little did I know that I was actually being considered for this opportunity, but I was being discounted because I had just returned from my first maternity leave, and the perception was she'll never go away to America, she'll never relocate the family because she has a young family or a young child. And were it not for the intervention of an older female colleague who stepped in on my behalf and said, you'll never know unless you ask her, that opportunity wouldn't have come my way. And once I was asked, within 4 weeks, we had relocated to the US, myself, my husband, and my young child. And that was a really influential part of my career trajectory. I ended up staying out there for 18 months. I got the international experience, and it ultimately culminated in me coming home and getting on the board of CPL, which was then a listed company, at the age of 37, and I joined their board. So I think in that instance, I absolutely experienced the unconscious gender bias, but it took somebody to stand up and speak out on my behalf to get me the opportunity that I deserved at the time, but which I was being discounted for because of my personal circumstances. And if I just give a very quick second example. Sorry, Hazel, go on.
I was going to say, Lorna, if that person didn't stand up, do you think you'd be in a completely different place right now?
I honestly believe that it would have influenced my career. I don't believe I would have gotten the international experience. So I've no doubt that was, a part of the career trajectory that would have shaped my future career and would have shaped the acceleration of my career had it not happened. It was a really great opportunity, and thank God for that woman who stepped in and stood up on my behalf. Just want to mention quickly the second example was when I was interviewing for a job, and I got down to the bottom 2, and I knew that my counterpart was a male candidate, and the head time, who I have high degrees of respect for, said to me, you're actually being discounted for this role because you're a mother of 3 children, and the view is that you will not have the flexibility or the ability to travel in this role, and this role involves quite a good degree of travel. And I mean, I was absolutely astounded, and I said, did you have that conversation with the male candidate? Why is this being me? Why is my personal ability to travel being questioned? And he was really taken aback. I actually just called out his own kind of unconscious bias, and I think he was really regretful and how he handled it. But there is this just presumption that women are the primary caregiver. It's like the default position, and I think it's incumbent on us to challenge that norm and sometimes be a little bit tougher on ourselves and not so that role and that position in society. It has to be a shared endeavour. So that really has been my experience. But otherwise it's been pretty good.
Yeah, and it's a very mix of unconscious bias, but also very conscious bias as well, by the sound of things. Orla, I'm going to move on lastly to you, but not least. So being the chair of Arthur Cox, I guess you get to look at the legalities of everything and how I guess discrimination forms and what can and can't be challenged. But on the topic of then unconscious, what slips through the net and how can we fix it in terms of kind of regulation even moving forward or recommendations?
Well, maybe, I mean, my experience may be slightly
different. And your
experience,
sorry, I should start off with saying your experience first, yeah.
maybe slightly different in that I joined the organization at Cox more than 25 years ago, and I joined an organization that had no female, 24 partners of the female partners, and today we have close to 40% are female. Because I've traveled the journey with the organization in terms of where we've come from. Have I witnessed bias? Yes, because I joined an organization where most decisions were made by men, and people make decisions. I mean, your speaker said it earlier. People make decisions informed by their own experience. So, if you don't have a broad range of experiences at the decision table, it is very limited, and organizations are limited if they don't have those voices at the table. So we've spent a lot of time, particularly in the last 10 years, looking at who makes the decisions and how broadly based is the decision-making process. That goes from, representation across practice areas, but also looking at sort of minimum numbers of females on our decision-making boards. And I was on some of our senior leadership groups from probably 9 years ago, and I've seen a big change in how we make decisions. And I would say we have a very progressive organization. We are really, really focused on diversity and inclusion. But if you don't have the right people at the table, it is very hard to address this, because decisions are made behind closed doors in a lot of cases, particularly around promotion and compensation. They're probably the two areas that are most important where decisions are made. So you need a really broadly based group of people there. And people, I think our organization is very progressive. People are very well-meaning, but they are informed by their own experiences. So it is really important that you get those experiences at the table. And I think we've worked hard at that. I've certainly seen it. I've seen assumptions. I think Lorna mentioned it there earlier around somebody coming back from maternity leave. You open with the assumption a lot of the time, people do, that person wants to scale back in terms of their ambition, scale back in terms of their work ethic. We have tried to encourage people to have the conversations. If you don't ask someone, you can't make that assumption. So really asking people those questions and encouraging people to make those questions, because otherwise I think there are, frankly, well-meaning assumptions made, but definitely full of unconscious bias, for sure, no doubt about it. So I'm not sure how you address this legally, but I think organizations can do a huge amount in their own decision making. That's really where it matters. It's at the executive team level and at the decision making level.
But do you think there's tools and techniques that businesses can do today to try to have more equality in the workplace?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, your speaker said it at the start. A lot of problems come from fast decisions. Like that's where the problems stem. People make intuitive, quick assessments. They say, to Laura's example earlier, you won't have the ambition to do this. That's the quick assessment. On big decisions, we try to really slow down the process. So when you're promoting someone, make it a longer process that gets as many voices into the room as possible, and as many challenging voices into the room as possible, not just the groupthink that often goes on in organizations, particularly at senior leadership. When you're making decisions around compensation, stand back from the decisions at the end to make sure that you haven't made a whole lot of decisions that are informed by bias. On a day-to-day basis, we have very formalized sponsorship programs, not just mentorship programs, sponsorship programs, because we've certainly found that if you have an organization where 70% of your senior people are male, it sort of happens by osmosis that you find a lot of sponsorship goes to very strong male candidates, and everyone's chasing a star. Let's be honest here, male or female, people are chasing stars. So we've really tried to formalize that and say everyone has to have a sponsor. Here's your responsibilities as a sponsor. You will be assessed as a partner in terms of how you do in that sponsorship role, and we are working hard at the moment. Probably work gets allocated. Who gets on the big mandates? Is that being shared out fairly? Those type of issues. And I think there's no big solution here, Lorna. I don't think there's any big solution, but it's incumbent on senior leaders to look at this every single day. It is 100 small things.
I was hoping this was all about you. I was hoping it was all about you telling me how enter really male-dominated careers. Like, what is your recommendation, Sinead, to people? How would you say to people watching it here how to get over the unconscious bias, how to excel in the position, but how to even get a foot up as well?
Yeah, I think an important point, taking from what Orla said, but also going back to what the scientist was telling us, that it has to be more than training. Actually, you have to look at the systems and processes that you have in place in a company. So we have like a whole menu of training, most of it mandatory, that we have for people around, recognizing your unconscious bias, looking at identifying microaggressions and behaviors within the workplace. But we also then above that, look at all of our processes right back to recruiting, how job descriptions are done, how the recruitment process runs. And we have what we call a diverse Slates initiative, and every hiring manager has to do this training to make sure that they literally can't make a hiring decision unless the final panel of candidates was diverse and representative. And they have to be able to prove that afterwards. So it's like training, then tracking against targets. We have a target to have our global workforce to be 50% female by 2025. It's currently 42.2%. But then drilling down into that and recognizing that in technical roles, it's only 28% female. At leadership, it's only 38% female. So how do we drive those up as well, and being transparent about our targets and how we're performing against them, tracking them internally with dashboards, audits of promotion processes, audits of compensation decision cycles, to make sure that there is equity in all of these decisions. And then even looking at the small things, what kind of social events are teams running? What kind of team building events are being done? Are there biases, that it's, are they occurring at, hours which are not suitable for people who are carers, be they male or female, and be it for children or for sick parents? Are they overly alcohol centered? Are they, very seriously heavy activity, which is great for the fitness fanatics amongst us, but actually, we don't all want to be cycling 20 miles before breakfast. So all of those things that make up the workplace. So training, yes, but tracking and transparency on how we're doing against targets.
Okay. I think we actually want to capture that data. We have a person here watching this webinar, Fiona Daly. She works in the Oireachtas, and part of what she wanted to do when it comes to this webinar is to track some of these suggestions, but also track data on how we can do better. So this is great to hear the suggestions. She's also been great in producing this webinar with Sinead O'Donnell. So I want to go to you, Norah, in talking about you talked about some of the past experiences that you've been experiencing. What about the future? And what about, because we talk about these barriers that are up in front of us and we're trying to tackle them, but if I was to ask you, what would you tell my 3.5-year-old daughter in terms of future barriers, in terms of what she's going to face and how we're going to look at them? What would you think needs to be tackled now? And what do you think our future projection will be like?
Thanks for the easy question, Hazel. I think I'm a total geek. Like, everyone thinks I'm somebody other than it, but I spent the whole of my late 20s publishing peer-reviewed journals. My claim to fame is I published evidence-based practice with the British Medical Journal, with the University of Oxford and York and Toronto. So whenever I'm confused about anything, I actually dive into the research. So I obsess about 23 to 53-year-olds. I don't think anybody who's about to go into C-suite or is on the way up the ladder needs me, because there's no end of power breakfasts for women, and they're on a growth mindset and they know how to retrieve information. But there's a funnel that goes into companies of fantastic 23-year-olds, both men and women, and usually the women have better competence than the men. We just see that time and again, that their academic qualifications tend to be higher. And yet he's 4 times more likely to get to that elusive corner office in the sky, and she's 4 times more likely to have left. So my whole life has been working on an initiative called Planet Woman. It was a joke to start with. I called it Planet Woman because I used to say, oh, we speak the language of women. Always that age group, that decade, 23 to 33. And as time went on, I had 14 researchers working with me, and we did a meta-analysis of all of the research that's been done as to why women and men progress differently in the workplace. Not a huge body of research, by the way, but when you take out the subjective ones and the ones that aren't properly peer-reviewed and aren't robust enough, you end up with actually just a series of behavioral studies that have been replicated so often that they're true. So what I would say is, on the one hand, the evidence that we have at the moment in Europe is that it'll be 60 years before we achieve gender equality. So that's 2081. So your daughter might be sipping a glass of champagne on New Year's Eve that year, toasting gender equality, or we could do something different. So I was glad you said that somebody was taking notes for the Oireachtas, because the one thing we don't have, listening to Lorna and Laura and Sinead talking, all of our companies do different things. And how do we know that they're effective or not effective? Because you almost need to do a longitudinal study to find out. We know there's 2 things that hold women back at 23. One is themselves, confidence, not competence. They understand all the rules of school. We know that from all the studies, the elementary studies, that young girls perform brilliantly at school. I remember Gemma Hussey, when she was education minister, telling me that the biggest change to young women's educational qualifications is when they removed the gender on the Leaving Cert exam, and that the testers didn't know. This is now decades ago. The testers no longer, but my era, by the way, the testers no longer knew whether it was a boy or a girl they were examining, and suddenly girls' qualifications went through the roof. So we know that confidence is one of the single biggest issues that young women face. Harvard just did a huge study. I put these things up on LinkedIn, so I'm talking about thousands of people took part in this study. They discovered that young women at 23...
We're going to be hitting you up for all these studies, by the way, since you just...
Hazel, I put them up all the time, because at 23, young women are 30% less confident than young men. I saw this in Dragon's Den all the time. Young men are quite full of bravado. They kind of over-predict their competence when young women predict their competence. The good news is at 40, we're equally confident, and at 50, women overtake men in confidence. This study confirmed. But what we really need to address is those behavioral studies. So the second thing is the corporate structure and the culture of an organization. A young woman going in at 23 to a bank looks way up and sees 1 woman at the top and maybe 2 in C-suite, maybe 3 in the pipeline. And although she comes in equal with male and female, she doesn't see a future there. And when she's a baby, that planet feels like it's intergalactic. It's so far away from where she is in her headspace, and culturally where she is. So for me, we spend all our time tinkering with structures that were designed 100% for men. And I would include the interview process and the recruitment process and talent management in all of that sector. It's all designed for men. The PE equipment that we got here in Ireland and everywhere else, designed for men. The temperature control in your office, designed for men. We already know the crash test dummies were all designed for men. So there's a whole webinar about talking about the unconscious bias of, science and research and where it goes with women. But what I would say to you is that some brave organization is going to say, we don't have to start from here. Why do we have to start from a corporate structure that relies on recruitment? I've been running women's awards for over 2 decades. Not one woman, and I'm talking about women at the height of political life or public life or in business, has stood on that stage and said, thank you very much, it's all about me. They stand up on that stage and say, it's not me, it's my team. And I'd just like to thank June and all the people down at that table there and everybody in my back room. You do it yourself, Hazel, all the time. Women like to feel that they're part of a team, and that means that they don't always put themselves forward for jobs. We know that from the Hewlett-Packard study, which is now 3 decades old, and maybe about 19 that have been replicated since then. Look at the EY Awards. came out first, saying, "Have I missed the women's bit? Where's the women's bit?" And then they finally found one woman to give an award to, and they came in and talked to me because I criticised them openly. And they said, "What can we do? Women don't put themselves forward for the awards." And I said, "Does that not tell you that your awards are the problem? Not the fact that women aren't putting themselves forward, because women don't put themselves forward for awards. They just don't. And they don't put themselves forward for jobs. And most of my life I've been mentoring women, trying to get them to go over the cliff and go for the job interview. But what if there was another way? What if we did some research and found another way?"
Well, this is the thing.
My
I
rant.
constantly. No. It's not even a rant. It's very factual, and it's the problems we're facing. So I'm laughing at someone who's sitting in the house that has all male portraits from previous Lord Mayors paintings, but this house is predominantly ran by women, and it is women that keeps this house going in terms of the staff in the background. And no Lord Mayor will be here without their team, and again ran by women. And this is funny. It's the same when we look at the political space. People go, "Why aren't women running?" Because we're putting barriers up for them so they can't run. Whereas if we change the system, people can do it. If we change the system, people can get recruited better in other industries as well. So Orla, I'm going to come to you on an age question. So I hope that's okay. So the age question is, does it become more acute as we are longer in industry? So, as you've gone on with your career, have you found that the unconscious or conscious bias become more acute, or do you think you just don't notice it anymore because it's, yeah?
I think it's more. I think people are more focused on it now. I mean, I agree with what others have said, and Sinead said training doesn't address it per se. It's helpful training, but it doesn't address it per se. But I think people are more aware of it. It's what you do. It's Nora's point. What do you do about it, right? What are the things we could do? I mean, I'm personally more hopeful. I think that we're sitting in probably the largest social experiment ever right now. And we talk a lot in our organization about where to from here, because to Nora's point, I think the quote that I think is amazing, probably one of the best quotes ever, is we send our daughters into workplaces designed for their grandfathers, which is, pretty much on the nose. But now we have a chance to really reimagine what work can be. And many progressive organizations have been doing it. But for everyone, we now know that flexibility can work. We now have the ability to take there were lots of bad things about the last 12 months, take the good of the last 12 months and take the best of what went before and try and take it forward. So there is an opportunity, I think, to reshape going forward. I think it needs to be very carefully taken, this opportunity, because it has the potential to be exclusionary. But I think if an organization is really committed to the next phase, it's taught us we don't need to have presenteeism. We don't need people in the office 5 days a week. But we need to be very inclusive in terms of how we do that. That we can't have a default where, leaders go into the office 5 days a week but say it's okay to work from home. I mean, that's not going to work. But there is a real opportunity going forward, I think, to try and tackle sort of gender inequality in how we design the workplace from here on. There is a real opportunity. We are definitely at an inflection point here now, in terms of how we might do it. In terms of, you asked about legislation and maybe tips for the Oireachtas. The one thing that's coming down the tracks and is I think getting a huge amount of focus from organizations and has the ability to be expanded is the gender pay gap legislation. Making organizations report in symmetrical terms what is that pay gap, what are their statistics like, and making legislation so they have to do it in a uniform way in a market where there is a war for talent. Let's be clear, and there's a clear war for talent. If you can allow organizations that are doing progressive things to differentiate themselves, that is a very powerful tool. I think that certainly, I know, in the legal profession outside Ireland has got an enormous focus, because, if you're a 23-year-old, to Nora's point, and you're looking at an organization, I wouldn't join our organization the way it was the day I joined. I mean, I join it today because it has nearly 40% women in leadership positions. I would never join the organization I joined in the 90s that had no female partners. I wouldn't do that today. And I wouldn't advise any 23-year-old to do it. So making people publish their statistics about what they're, I think, is a really, I think that actually ability really make people think about bias and other issues.
And this that kind of hits the nail on the head, Orla, because for our audience who would have heard of gender pay gap, the gender pay gap currently is on average 14.4%, which means women can stop working around the early November part of the year, and still they're getting paid the same as men. That's the problem. So of the same work they're doing. So 14.4 is on average the difference, and that's something that we need to start looking at. So the other points that we've got through is maternity and paternity benefits, because I know Lorna had touched on it in terms of, and Sinead as well, of how these things should be shared and how companies should look at sharing the roles more, so to provide more paternity leave, but provide a maternity roadmap in terms of our government as well. And I think the minister herself, Minister McEntee, has brought this to the fore with her own experience, and I am delighted that she will be taking maternity leave, and I hope that us as a society can do something different in the next year to support it. So Lorna, I'm going to move back to you on, you work for one of the biggest recruitment organizations in the world. So we talk about kind of unconscious bias throughout the workplace, but one of the things Laura touched on was making the system change so that people would apply more, so that you're almost changing it so that it's not set up to be a male-dominated system for people to apply into, which wouldn't fit. What would you recommend, being one of the senior positions of a large recruitment organization, is what are the techniques, or what would be the things that you would bring in, or you would like to see people brought in when it comes to the recruitment process, so to tackle unconscious bias?
Sure. I think there's a few things that can be done. I think, first of all, you've got to check yourself. You've got to really be completely honest with yourself. You mightn't realize your bias until you actively seek it out. So you've got to leave your bias at the interview door to the very best of your ability. And that's having honest conversations about yourself and about the inherent biases, because we all have them. None of us are immune to biases. Every single one of us has them. It's just about trying to be as conscious of them as we possibly can. You can deploy new techniques, artificial intelligence. In CPL, for instance, we support clients by using AI in terms of sourcing candidates, and it allows us to filter out certain attributes about a candidate that we might unconsciously discriminate against. So that's a powerful tool that's kind of being used more and more in the industry. Use a structured, scripted interview process. So if you have a script whereby you're interviewing people and you are asking them the same questions, you're almost liberating the recruitment focus, or the recruitment process rather, from inherent bias. So that's a way of leveling the playing field when you're looking to recruit candidates. And also involve men and women in the recruitment process. It's well known that women will hire more women and men will hire more men. So when you've got a bit of a balance in terms of recruitment and selection process, you have more of a chance of having better gender representation when you're looking for roles. And then also check your job description. Apparently there's 25,000 phrases in job adverts that could indicate some type of gender bias. And I think that's a fascinating fact, actually, because that might repel people from applying for a job, because a certain language is being used that is putting people off or making them feel that they're not a fit in terms of that job advert. So there's, that's very basic stuff that you can do and put in place around a recruitment process.
Hey, thank you, Lorna. And this is something that we hope companies can take on board, but it's also, in fairness, from my position and Fiona's on writing a report and recommendations, is something that we need to put in terms of these are suggestions, and we want things to be research-based, because this comes down to then the audience question that came in, and what we're going to wrap up on is that we all talk about change, and we all talk about kind of recommended change. What someone wants to know is, what is your one thing that you think needs to change right now in terms of tackling conscious, unconscious bias, the whole lot, in light of International Women's Day? What is the one thing you would like to see change or change yourself? Sinead? not a hard question at all. So.
Look, there's lots of, you could go through a whole list of practical things, but I think one important thing is a mindset change within businesses, organizations, that, having a diverse and inclusive workforce is not a nice to have or a nice to do. It actually makes good business sense. It makes for a better company, it makes for better customer service, and it makes for a better product. I learned this in my first, I suppose, introduction to the importance of having a diverse and inclusive workforce was when I worked at the Police Service of Northern Ireland, where, a police service has to be representative of the community that it serves. Similarly, if you're designing products, there's no point in having one single demographic designing a product that they think is going to be amazing for them, but then, if there was a woman product manager on the team, or somebody from a different ethnicity, or somebody with a different ability, they would say, look, you might think that's wonderful, but my lived experience would suggest otherwise. So it's just that mindset around the business case for diversity. It's not, yes, we can go through the human rights and it's equitable and it's equality, but actually, you know what? If we convince boardrooms and C-suites that it's good for business, maybe that's what will finally help us to break through.
Thank you, Sinead. Lorna, I'm going to switch up the order. So.
Yeah, I think, I'm kind of echoing exactly what Sinead said there. And I think in addition to the mindset, maybe we could start considering some of the language that we use when we talk about promoting women and embracing the value that they bring to organizations. So it's a little less about the victimhood and kind of poor women not being, equally represented in society and in business and in politics, etc. And it's more about showcasing continuously and demonstrating the real value that women bring both to business, to politics, to society. And I feel that's a lot more empowering. It's better language to use, I think, when we talk about women and the contribution that we can make to society. Sometimes I feel that the language and the rhetoric can get too far down into, women, they're not being given a fair leg up on the ladder, or they're not being given a fair kind of opportunity or equal presentation. I think we should empower ourselves a little bit better and use stronger language that demonstrates our contribution. And that's a really positive place, I think, that we can push on as a gender that accounts for 50% of the population.
Absolutely. Orla.
Look, I could totally agree with what Lorna and Sinead have said, and I agree with Lorna. The debate is often what's wrong with women, not which I think is very much the wrong question. I would agree with Sinead. I think the risk sometimes is the debate gets a little woolly, and it's the right thing to do, which it is. It clearly is, but actually you need to convince people. And certainly in our business, I'm saying, no graduates are female. If we are not focused on this issue, it is simply bad business. Like, it is that simple. It is that simple for us. So a mindset shift is really important. I think that mindset shift to say it is not a nice to have. If you actually believe in your business and you are not really focused on fixing this issue, then you don't really believe in your business. I say that to our partners all the time. If you are not really convinced, if you are not focused on this issue, you are simply not focused on the business. It is that simple. So, but I do think, people are motivated by metrics, very motivated by what's black and white. So the more businesses have very clear internal metrics, and the more the government is encouraging businesses to publish their metrics, the sooner we will move this debate on. I think clear published data.
So transparency and data. Okay. Last but not least, Norah, who will also close us out.
Thank you. Well, I was going to finish on a bit more of a global view, because I used to say if women ruled the world, wouldn't it be a great place? And then it turned out that in areas of the world where women do rule, it is a better place. It started with Jacinda Ardern, and everyone just wondered, well, what is it about her? How is it that New Zealand's doing so well? And then, of course, the critics said, well, it's so isolated, it's miles away from everywhere, and it may have the same population size, but that's the only reason they can achieve it. Then 2 universities came together and looked at 196 countries in the world. 10% of them were run by women. And what do they discover? All of those countries, and I include Finland and Taiwan and Germany, lower COVID cases and lower deaths from COVID. They even did comparisons like for like from country to country. I am not a political person. I've never joined a political party, but I would say that what women bring to the table of a crisis is this clear sense of responsibility, pragmatism and empathy. When Christian Lagarde said in the last recession, more Lehman sisters than Lehman brothers, she meant that. Women elaborated on it 2 months ago and said they step up to the plate and they do so in a way that people understand. So although we have the business case, totally irrefutable coming through from Accenture, KPMG and all of the others showing that where there's balanced boards and gender balanced businesses, better return on equity, better profit, they outperform their competitors. We also need to recognize that politically, we need to do something about women. We shouldn't even be discussing the fact that we have a minister that needs to potentially or was potentially going to have to resign in order to have maternity leave. It is ridiculous and embarrassing for Ireland in this day and age to be discussing that. I would say two other things. As much as the pandemic has proved my point, without having to do a million longitudinal studies, women leaders are brilliant leaders. Gender balanced business, irrefutably, they do better than non-gender balanced business. I would also say to all companies, of which there are many in Ireland, that have all male boards, the evidence. You show me the evidence that all male boards work, because there isn't any evidence out there at all. Yet you require of me and all other women that I show you the evidence that gender balance works, and we have done that. So it's, and lastly, I'd say stop pussyfooting around and bring in quotas. I am one of those women who spent the whole of my life saying we don't need quotas, we should stand on merit, and all of us came to the realization that if we want to change, the only change that's happening in Europe is actually in countries where there are quotas. We need to bring in quotas, and if there's a bit of tokenism, going back to my earlier point, it's alive and well already. It's just that the men are the tokens rather than the women. Thank you for having us.
Unmute. No, I agree with you on all of it. So, and I'm sure people will give out to me at some stage, agreeing so much on what we need to do on the government side. But we do. There's so much we can be doing right now. So, and we need to do it. So, thank you so much to the four of you. I know you're so busy in your schedule, so I really appreciate this. To our audience, thank you for coming, and to the four panelists for giving their time. They literally just did me a solid and said they will do this. So I did rope them into it. So thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure. And it's great to hear such strong voices and leadership in different industries. So again, thank you. Bye-bye, Laura. Bye-bye, Orla, Lorna, Sinead. Folks, in a few minutes, we're going to bring in former President Mary McAleese to have a chat about unconscious bias. She did a lot of research on it, so it'll be a quick chat. If people would like to stay on, it'll be 2 minutes time. Thank you.
I'm trying. It's not going on. Hang on a second. No, it's on. No. Yeah.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Hazel. How are you? Good to talk to you. It's good to listen to that. I have to say there's some fascinating insights there now and experience.
Well, in fairness, when Laura brought in the line about current situation in relation to what we're doing, yeah, there's so much we could be doing. So we need to do it. Are we live yet, or are we going to be live in 2 minutes? Oh, we're live right now. Okay, I'm really glad I didn't say more. I'm only kidding. In fairness, this is a very informal chat, everyone. So, and we aim to try to get as much out of it as possible, but it is supposed to be a chat, and everything is open for discussion, especially within the area of unconscious bias, because right now we have Mary McAleese, former president and lecturer, professor in Queen's, that did a lot of research on the area of unconscious bias. So it's great to actually have her here today, because she would have been on the background researching it and on the foreground experiencing it. So Mary, how are you? How's everything?
I'm good, thank you. Good, thank you. Fascinating to listen to those conversations. You mentioned Queen's. When I went back to work in Queen's in 1987, leaving Trinity. And one of the first things that happened when I arrived there were two reports, one from the Fair Employment Commission that monitored and measured the employment of Catholics, which was problematic in Northern Ireland, and one from the Equal Opportunities Commission, which monitored and measured the employment of women. And two reports said that Queen's were deficient as a university University and the lead university, and of course a big contributor to the city, that it was deficient in both. So a group of us got together, I as a lawyer, others as social scientists, psychologists, behavioral scientists, and we realized that in order to change those statistics, and we knew they had to change because now there was an accountability mechanism, and the university was embarrassed. It didn't want to be embarrassed. It had to respond. And so we formed a group. We trained ourselves. We became trained in conscious and unconscious bias, and we set up a scheme for training and retraining our 3,000 members of staff, because we knew that, for example, we relied heavily in recruitment on interview processes, and there's the danger that people walk into interview processes carrying with them the baggage of unconscious bias, and out of the interview process come people who reflect back to them that bias, that very bias. And so we 3,000 members of staff over a 2-year period went through this really very, at times quite difficult training process, but essentially it was retraining because you were retraining yourself. We had to do it ourselves. We had to strip, the 10 of us who were the trainers, we had to try and strip away our own conscious and unconscious biases. And then we had to help others to do the same, to grow an awareness of how dangerous both conscious and unconscious biases are. And we were very successful, I have to say, because over a period, well, we were certainly very successful in relation to Catholics. It always strikes me as extraordinary that the numbers of Catholics employed, that graph started to go up very encouragingly, much slower in relation to women, much slower. And what that taught us was that the embedded bias in relation to women, that it went much deeper. It took a lot more effort, if you like, to crowbar it out. And my grandmother always used to say that, what's learned in childhood is engraved on stone. And unconscious bias against women in particular.
That's
Sorry, go ahead.
really interesting. That's really interesting, but also slightly terrifying that people were able to get over the religious bias quicker than even the gender bias of things. So, well,
I often used to say in response to that the religious bias only went back to the Reformation, whereas the gender bias went back to Roman law, Judaic law. It was thousands of years old and embedded. And it's not actually funny, because the truth of the matter is that Roman law, which was the great system of patria potestas, where the head of the male head of the clan had power over everything and everybody, including women. Women were the lowest in the pile. They could use violence against them. They could kill them with impunity. And we entered the 20th century. Believe it or not, we had the Roman Empire hasn't existed for a millennium and a half and more, and we went into the 20th century with many examples still of remnants of patria potestas, rape and marriage, domestic violence, the use of violence against women, which was not dealt with by police and certainly not dealt with properly by laws or indeed by our society. These things buried because the view was, well, they're happening to women, so what? What would you expect? And we took a long time to dismantle that. The whole laws in relation to corporal punishment, we took a long time to dismantle. And so what I learned from that was the long shelf life of attitudes absorbed into our laws, our thinking, our practices, our procedures, our institutions and our structures, and that have a horribly long shelf life and a very, very, very long history. And I think an awareness of that is terribly important if we want to, as we do, encourage more women into political life, into institutional life, into working life. Because if you take the realization that casual bias that lies in every one of us, it's in our mums, our grandmothers, our mothers, our fathers, our neighbours, our teachers, it's out there. And if we understand that, and if we have an awareness of it, we have some chance of fighting it and neutralizing it. Because just take the casual bias that a child might encounter in the home. A child who says, I would like to be whatever, I want to be a truck driver, and back comes, oh no, only men do that. No, you can't do that. Or I would like, as happened to me when I was 14 or 15, I would like to be a lawyer. Oh, you can't do that because you're a woman. Now, that bias can paralyze. It can be responsible for what we heard from your 4 panelists a moment ago, the lack of confidence in women, even with the best of qualifications, the lack of confidence and the feeling that somehow there is a gap between not just the feeling, but the reality that there's a gap between their level of confidence and the confidence of an equivalently educated and young man. That's very, very difficult. And that casual bias that exists in the community, that is encountered in casual conversation, and it can be very paralyzing of ambition. That the person who decides not to apply for a job. But the other side of that, just to finish off the point, when you take the downstream consequence of that casual bias into an interview, into an official setting, it can paralyze careers. Somebody who's made the effort, who's made the application, who's gone for the job interview and encounters that casual bias, which says, oh, she's a woman, she's going to get pregnant, she's going to have kids. We can't afford to be paying money for somebody who's going to be out, 3 times having children over the course of the next 10 years of her career. Those are the kinds of things that won't be said, but will be carried in the heads of people who are making the decisions. So the paralyzing effect, the numbing effect of casual and both conscious and unconscious bias is really, it paralyzes all of us as community in the end, because it stops true equality from emerging. It stops true potential from flourishing. And so that's why we have to do the kinds of things that we heard from our panelists there. I'm really very conscious of how important it is to have to measure it, to have the scholarship brought to it, to measure how many women are in those jobs, where are they in those jobs, at what level are they, what qualifications do they have over and against the men in those jobs. And we need the measurements. And then we need to be able to, around that, build the structures that say, here's a problem in your workplace. Your workplace is not reflecting the fact that it has X number of women, it has X number of men, but somehow or other, there's a ceiling there. The women don't seem to get beyond it. And to break open the secrecy around that, to deprivatize it, to push it out into the public forum, to make those institutions and workplaces responsible for plans to get beyond those problems and those obstacles. That has been key in my lifetime. The planning and in a sense, almost the embarrassment that is brought to bear on organizations that are not measuring up and are not clearly giving full civic equality to women.
And that transparency that you speak of, and this is why I want to bring it back into your original point of the study of the 3,000 and being able to show very precisely kind of the research. I guess from speaking to our earlier panelists that you heard, there's also the need to talk about personal experience as well and how people have experienced this to go into the research. We have a question here on, have you experienced it during your career and witnessed it during your career? How have you tackled it, I guess, in your own career? Have you witnessed it and tackled it?
I have to say, in fairness, I've witnessed it both ways. I mean, I remember going to my boss in Trinity College, then Professor Paul O'Higgins, the late Paul O'Higgins, absolutely brilliant boss. And I went to him to explain to him that I was pregnant with twins. And now I was going to have to take time off in the middle of an academic year. And knowing that was going to cause some upset, some upheaval in the department. And I went embarrassed. And I started off the conversation saying to him, I'm sorry, Paul, I don't have good news for you. I've got bad news. And he absolutely, he ate me out of it, to put it in his nice way. He said to me, don't ever say that if you're talking about being pregnant and having a family. He said, that's a wonderful thing. That's a joyful thing. He said, everything else is just a practical problem. We can cope with that. We're not beyond getting somebody in to cover for you. We're not and he just went through all the all the possibilities of all the practical things that I was embarrassed by. I think many women experience that in the workplace, terrified to go in and say they're pregnant, terrified at interviews, certainly for a job, to say that they plan to have a family. That should not be the case. Those things need to be stripped away and stripped out, but there is much in me as they are. I mean, I was carrying my own bias against the fact that I was pregnant. And here I met a very, very redeemed man, quite a revolutionary and a radical in his day. I mightn't have met that if I was in a different workplace. And so I think there are many women who do meet the opposition to that. They would not meet a Paulo Higgins type, and they know that, and they live in fear. And so, and we carry that. For example, when I was a youngster in Belfast, one of the things we had to do to get us placed in a grammar school was this thing called the 11 plus exam. About 25% of kids got the 11 plus, which meant they got into the better, so-called more academic schools. We discovered, thanks to the probing of a brilliant lawyer, also now dead, Trinity College graduate Michael Keogh, we discovered very late in the day that in fact the 11 plus system was strongly weighted against girls. That they had already secretly, the system had decided that it was more important to provide more places for young boys than it was for young girls. So already the system was loaded against women, and we didn't know it. We were completely unaware of it until the great probing of a lawyer drew that out, and it had to stop. So we need structure. We need ways of probing. We need that will give us truths about institutions. And then we need to confront those institutions with truths, and they need to draw up plans and structures for redemption of situations in which women are penalized simply by being women. Because as we've heard time and again, we heard it from Sinead, we heard it from Lorna, we heard it from Orla, we heard from all of them, that all the evidence is in that where there is gender balance in a workplace, and where there is true equality and affirmation and encouragement of all the talents, both male and female, those institutions and workplaces flourish. But we only have to look at the Catholic Church, and it, particularly in the Western world, where it most certainly is not flourishing, to see an institution which is one of the key influencers in the world, the biggest NGO in the world, biggest property holder of private property in the world, an educator of children and young women right throughout the third world, permanent representative status at the UN. We look at that huge institution and we see an institution that is not flourishing in the Western world. And it's pretty obvious why, because it does not either use or encourage or provide for the effective and efficient use of the talents of the women in the church. And in fact, it's worse than that. Of course, it conspires to keep them out. And that would be true not just of the Catholic Church. It would be true of, if we're looking at as this is a global problem. Sometimes it is forgotten that underpinning many of our laws in cultures right around the world is the fact that they are underpinned by very, very strong religious conservatism. And that is true of Islam. It is true of Christianity in general. And these account for more than half the world population. So these are deeply important key influencers whom we need to be engaged in dialogue with if we want to stop the pervasive paralysis of not just of A, the ambitions of women, and then B, the flourishing of women, because those two things are connected to the flourishing of all humankind.
And I think to your point of how do we make that connection and how do we push is really important. And this is why we need, I think, a push from our own political sphere and also our own religions and leaders of our religions. I'm going to bring you back to a couple of points ago, Mary, just because we heard Laura talk about it and we heard Lorna talk about it as well in terms of maternity. And you touched on it there in terms of Paul Higgins. And I wish there were more Paul Higgins in the world, but because it's very obvious this week when we look at the Minister of Justice on the issues there. And we look at, even from my own party, that someone had to step down in terms of not having maternity leave. Like, what in your position of having been a former president, of having been a brilliant lawyer, still is, what would you what's your view on it? What do you think we need to do when it comes to public office holders and how we support them, but also across industry? How do we make sure that sometimes very conscious bias is addressed, and what do we need to do in terms of the steps going forward? I guess my question is, what's your view on what has transpired in the last couple of weeks on the issue?
I think it's very disappointing that we are, this far into the 21st century, and that this issue has arisen, and we've, discovered not for the first time that it remains unresolved. Actually, in many ways, it's instructive. It tells us how far we still have to travel, and how slow we are, and how slow we have been to address issues of both conscious and unconscious bias that impact particularly on women in the workplace. So if we wonder, and we do, why there are so few women in the Dáil, in the Seanad, in our Oireachtas, why so few women are in politics, and we look at the obstacles that are in their way, and then we go right to the top and we see a young minister who wants to start a family, and we discover suddenly that that there is no structure in place, as there would be, for example, in an ordinary workplace, that would allow her to take maternity leave with all the guarantees and all the protections that law offers to women in the workplace today, and that have been really hard earned over many years. So if we want answers as to why women are inhibited from politics, well, there's one staring us in the face, isn't it? Where's the creche? Where are the childcare facilities, not just for women, but also for men who have children? So I think that the fact that we are still discussing this tells me that we're still in the opening chapters of the emancipation of women. The opening chapters. I mean, not that very long ago, I was giving a talk in King's Inns about women in law. And because we were reflecting back on the fact that it was just 100 years ago since the law was passed, which allowed women to enter the legal profession. Imagine 100 years, and 100 years before that, a law was passed that allowed Catholics to enter the legal profession. This is what empowered Dan O'Connell. So, we're opening up new chapters all the time, but somehow we forget. It's very easy for young people now who course through the massification of third level into the professions not to realize that the history which allows them, on which their lives are now built, the opening chapters are very thin. If you were to sit and write the story of women in law, it's a very, very, very thin chapter, and the hold that elites had. Male elites had on these roles, whether it was entry to profession as a vet or a doctor, or I think of Trinity College, for example, that didn't allow women to, it was 300 years old before it allowed women in. I think of Cambridge, that didn't let women in until the 1940s. And when I tell my kids this, they look at me and go, "Oh, don't be ridiculous," because it does seem now to a generation which has grown up with equal opportunities and with structures in place to vindicate their equal opportunities, that does seem ridiculous. And yet there are lacunae. And those lacunae have been, showcased extraordinarily in the case of Minister Helen McEntee. It is awful, isn't it, that we have to now deal with that, and that we hadn't dealt with it before. I mean, we should have dealt with it way back in the days when Norah Quinn gave birth to her little baby. I remember that well. And she was a junior minister, I think, at the time. So we've had decades to do it, and we didn't. Why? There's a classic case of unconscious bias against women that needs to be addressed. And it's good to hear our politicians, our leaders saying, we're going to get to that now.
I know, and it's funny because it's unconscious insofar it's gotten to this stage, you need to address it, but it's also very conscious insofar we look at 950 odd local authority councillors, among which 22% are women, and within that there is no provision for maternity leave, and that has been a fight that I know
Correct.
my former colleagues, I look at the Councillor Claire Byrne and Councillor Janice Boylan, that have been fighting for a long time for, and that has been very conscious. So it's great to see that this has now become this, not quite a bubble, it's become a peak that we are talking about it and we're trying to address it. I'm really hoping that in terms of legislation that it will, the various ministers can look into it and fix this issue. But it also, I think your line of, it is the beginning, the opening chapters, it terrifies me, because everything when it comes to our equality has been hard earned and hard fought. And I guess this is my question, next question that has been asked to our audience is, what is the biggest barriers you think facing future leaders? Because you are a leader, like have been an immense icon to so many women. So what do you think from your experience and looking forward, what are the biggest barriers of facing it, and how
biggest barrier is to think that we have cracked it, that it's over, that we've everything in place, and that if we do nothing, that by some magic, a heft and a momentum is going to galvanize and remain and keep the pressure on to produce a culture of total equality of citizenship. I don't believe that is true. I go back to 1918 when women got the vote, and people thought then that it's over now. We've got the vote. Women can, and then we got the law. In relation to sexual discrimination, women could become lawyers. We thought it was over. We actually were foolish enough to believe that once we got these milestones, once we pocketed those, that we could take our foot off the pedal. And what we didn't realize was that in the terrain and in the souterrain, there was just a whole, and in the thinking and in the law and in the perceptions, there were these massive obstacles that were always going to get in the way unless we took, I use Seamus Heaney's great expression of the people who were the first generation of educated people who got second level and then third level education. He called them intelligence as brightened and unmannerly as crowbars. And they needed to take their intellects, their brilliance and their excellence, and use it as crowbars to keep working on clearing the pathway ahead. And believe me, the pathway ahead is still not clear. I mean, I think the Helen McEntee thing is an example of that. Somebody, when we think of all the work that has been done to give women equality in the workplace, and still we have the pay gap, still we have the reality that COVID has impacted most egregiously on women in workplaces and women in the home. All those things still continue to happen because somehow or other we took our foot off the gas, we took our foot off the pedal, and we did not follow through with the first of all, the studies that would tell us where the obstacles still are, and then with the laws, the legislation, the procedures, and the protocols that would take those obstacles and remove them and ensure that they didn't continue to clog up the journey ahead for young women.
And the thought that this isn't even close to the end is, I guess, a scary one, but also it sets up the challenge that I've noticed with the various campaigns that have happened in the last decade, that once we have public involved and once we actually have people who are buying into it, we can push for better, and we can push for the challenge to be met. So it's great to hear you outline, well, what exactly it is that we need to look at and we need to start doing better. Here's another question for you from a listener. What do you think, as former president, you would have met with the heads of states in countless countries worldwide. Is there any country which you would admire the most when it comes to gender equality?
Oh, I think there are a number of countries. I think of Finland in particular. And I take the point that was made earlier, I think by Norah, about the women who have found themselves heading up governments facing COVID. And I take that, but I also remember, as a former citizen of the United Kingdom, being led by Margaret Thatcher, who was awful, just plain awful as a leader, plain awful in Northern Ireland terms. Her activities probably prolonged the Troubles, regrettably. So at the same time as saying that, I have to be able to say that I don't believe there is, a one size and one personality and one set of abilities that fit all women who come to the top. And I think we have to be prepared for diversity of talents, and people will come to the top with whose policies I will disagree emphatically. And there are a number of leaders, female leaders, both historically and probably more recently, who one would disagree with. And so I think there's a dangerous argument, and actually, again, it's very often made by people out of religious systems, that women are going to bring a different set of, and a much more benign and nurturing set of credentials to leadership. And I think that may be true of some women, and it's clearly true, for example, of Jacinta Ardern, who's fantastic. There are, yes, those qualities, but I also see, for example, those from Joe Biden, a very pastoral man, and is going to be a great pastoral president. So I think if we're talking about full equality, we have to be prepared to say that whatever the talents of women and whatever the politics they have, they're entitled. They are entitled to the opportunity to shine and to succeed, and to be encouraged and nurtured by systems that do not have braking mechanisms designed to hold them back. So I've met fantastic women leaders. I've met fantastic male leaders who were great champions of women. And so I think the future has got to be a place where a talented youngster, particularly a young girl who says in her own home what she wants to be, will not suddenly find a tsunami of inhibition thrown at her by a father, a mother, an auntie, an uncle, a granda, or somebody outside, or a teacher, God forbid. But actually that they will stop and say, I've got to be very careful here how I respond, because one word, can nudge a child in the wrong direction. And one word can nudge a child in the right direction. And because encouragement is such a wonderful thing, it really is. To be encouraged, I think, and is to be nurtured in yourself. And that's to hear. So we have to be conscious that from the earliest days, we want to tell our children, think carefully about what you'd like to be. We'll help you along the way. And in terms of, and then we need to be sure that we have system that as that child goes to school, goes into the workplace, goes into college, goes into the workplace, that all the way along, we are a culture that nurtures ability, and that is true whether we're dealing with people who have disability, that we nurture ability and do not, that we don't inhibit ability.
I think you're spot on there. I've been spending the year telling people that we should celebrate diversity and not be scared of it. And in terms of nurturing ability, I think we should, as you said, if a child wants to be whatever they want to be, or what we should be doing is encouraging them. My 3.5-year-old wants to be an astronaut. Well, that was yesterday. Tomorrow she might want to be something else. So, but my dad was on the phone from Hong Kong, and you can see by the look on his face, he was a bit skeptical, going, what do you mean she wants to be an astronaut? Are we sure she should be thinking that? But my straight reaction was, she can be whatever she wants to be, leave her alone. And I think this is, as you say, what we need to start doing in society, that there is no, barriers from our young age. You shouldn't be told, you can't do it because you're a girl. You can't do it because you're from this background, or you can't do it because you're this color. I think we need to stop and check ourselves in that regards. But Mary, I'm going to ask you one last question and we'll be wrapping up. A lot of people are watching this, and a lot of people, I think younger people will be watching this, wanting to know, well, what can they do to for their careers? And I was asking the last panel this in terms of what is the leg up almost, but in this case, the question has come in is, how do they excel and perhaps one day become the president of Ireland? What is your advice?
Well, I think the first thing about that is to remember, it's one person every 7 years. And so there's going to be a process to get there. And so I would suggest to them, choose a career that you're going to love, and do your best in it. And make it a career that also offers you the opportunity to be of service to your community, to be able to analyse its problems and address, not all of them, but maybe one of them, and to commit to that and to give it your all, whether it's in the workplace or whether outside of work, that you have a vocation of service to the improvement and betterment of your society. And so I think that's the pathway, that's the pathway. That'll bring you plenty of hassle, and it'll give you plenty of work, but it'll also bring you fulfillment. The other thing I think that's so important today, and it's easier today to do than it was in the past, and that is to call out bias. And it doesn't mean being always confrontational. It just means saying, do you see what you just said there? I think that there's an unconscious bias in that. I think that there's something wrong about that. You just think about that for a moment. And I think to call it out, and if it is particularly egregious bias, if it is oppressive, to use within your workplace or within our legal system, to use the mechanisms that are available to you and the agencies and the support, whether they are informal supports or they could be advocacy groups or self-help groups, charities, whatever, use them to help you to stand your ground. I remember a time when I experienced really serious, I would say, oppressive behaviour in a workplace, and I stood my ground all right, and I eventually left that workplace. But I'm conscious that if the same things were to happen today, there are mechanisms in place and there are laws in place that would have given me protection that I didn't have then. And so, and I think that that's one of the great things about today, that the protective mechanisms that we now have in place are more sophisticated. They mightn't be perfect, but they are better. And also, I think you're dealing with a public that is much less skeptical and much less likely to say to you, oh, don't rock the boat, but is actually more likely to say, maybe that's a boat you need to rock. I think of all the abuse cases. If we were relying on institutions, I'd take the churches, and the Catholic Church is a classic example. If we were relying on that church, this biggest NGO in the world, to tell us what it got wrong and where it went wrong, it would never have happened. We would never have we'd never have had the Ryan report, the Murphy report. We'd never have had the Mother and Babies Homes report. We'd never have had the Michael and Laundries report. Why? We had those because victims decided they'd had enough. It was time to speak. And we had people who spoke courageously out of absolute deafening silence, and then who were helped by individuals and organizations and self-help groups and civic groups and lawyers to galvanize the heft and the momentum needed to tell us and to reveal to us the truth. So don't expect big institutions and organizations to offer up, to volunteer their malpractice or indeed their unconscious bias. They need, we will need structures outside of them to both carrot and stick to keep them honest.
Yeah, no, and I think that's essential. And I think this is why we have these conversations, and we're hoping to send this report then to Minister O'Gorman and Minister McEntee. So we're now over time. So thank you so much, Mary. Just so everyone knows Yeah, just so everyone knows, on the matter of not calling out bias and calling out abuse, I have a massive thank you to say to Mary here. Insofar, she rang me after there were issues here in the house in terms of abuse, and she rang me out of the blue to offer support and call out the abuse as well. And this is what we mean by there is no such thing as an innocent bystander. Everyone's in it, and everyone acts as a community. And I'd like to say a massive thank you, Mary, to you for offering that support and also for being here today. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Solidarity is so important in this battle for equality, isn't it?
It is, and we're all in it together. I know that's the phrase we use all year, but we've always been in it together, and we need to keep doing it. So thank you so much. We'll see you back here next couple of weeks for the anti-racism webinar. But thank you, Mary, and thank you to my panel, and thank you to the team from Grooveyard WH, and also Fiona Daly, and my staff here, who I wouldn't be able to run this year without. So thank you so much, folks. Bye-bye.